when 72-year-old Margaret Wilson hung an American flag outside her small home. She thought she was honoring her late husband, a Marine who died serving his country. But just 3 days later, the HOA taped a violation notice to her front door. And what happened next destroyed an entire neighborhood's reputation overnight. Because Margaret wasn't just any widow, and the internet was about to make sure the whole country knew it. Margaret Wilson lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood outside Phoenix, Arizona. Small lawns, perfect sidewalks, matching mailboxes. The kind of neighborhood where every flower pot had rules attached to it. And at the center of everything was the HOA president, Carol Henderson, 58 years old, obsessed with appearances, obsessed with control, and according to several neighbors, completely impossible to argue with. But Margaret never caused problems. She kept to herself, watered her roses every morning, waved at passing kids, and every single evening, she sat alone on her porch beside a folded American flag, the same flag that once covered her husband's coffin. Margaret's husband, Daniel Wilson, served in the Marines for 26 years. 2 tour overseas, Purple Heart recipient, respected by everyone who knew him. When he died from complications connected to his military injuries, Margaret thought the hardest part of her life was over. But grief changes people. The house became quieter. The nights became longer. And for the first time in nearly 50 years, Margaret was completely alone. Until one morning, she opened an old wooden chest in the garage. Inside was Daniel's folded ceremonial flag, perfectly preserved. Margaret later told a neighbor something heartbreaking. She said, "I just wanted him to feel close again." So she bought a brand new American flag, placed it carefully outside her front porch, and every morning, she saluted it before drinking her coffee. For Margaret, it wasn't politics. It wasn't attention. It was love. It was memory. It was the last connection she had left. 3 days later, a white envelope appeared on Margaret's door. HOA violation notice. Reason: unauthorized oversized flag display, violating neighborhood aesthetic guidelines. Margaret thought it had to be a mistake. The flag wasn't damaged, wasn't offensive, and according to federal law, HOAs generally cannot ban American flags outright. So Margaret politely called the HOA office. That's when she spoke to Carol Henderson. And according to Margaret, the conversation immediately turned cold. Carol allegedly said, "Military family or not, rules apply to everyone." Margaret tried explaining the meaning behind the flag, but Carol interrupted her. Then came the sentence Margaret would never forget. "Your emotional attachment does not override community standards." Silence. Margaret later said she sat in her kitchen crying after that phone call. Not because of the violation, but because she felt humiliated. Like her husband's sacrifice meant nothing to them. Margaret decided not to remove the flag. That's when things escalated. A second notice arrived, this time with a fine, $50 per day. Then neighbors started noticing strange things. HOA inspectors repeatedly driving past Margaret's home. Photos being taken. Letters taped to her garage. One afternoon, Margaret walked outside and found a neon orange warning sticker attached directly to the flagpole. Neighbors watched from their windows. Some looked uncomfortable. Others stayed silent, because nobody wanted problems with Carol. And Carol knew it. The HOA board meeting happened that Thursday night. Margaret attended alone, carrying a framed photograph of her husband in uniform. When it was finally her turn to speak, the room became quiet. Margaret stood there trembling, then softly said, "My husband fought for this country. I didn't think honoring him would become a violation." Several people looked down, but Carol remained expressionless. Then she responded, "This board cannot make emotional exceptions." You could hear people whispering. Even board members looked uneasy. But the vote still passed, 3-2. Margaret would have 10 days to remove the flag, or face legal action. For the next week, Margaret stopped sitting outside. Her curtains stayed closed. Neighbors said her porch light no longer turned on at night. Then something unexpected happened. A teenager named Ethan Ramirez uploaded a 30-second video to social media. He lived across the street from Margaret. The video showed the American flag outside her home, and the HOA warning notices taped to her door. But what made the clip explode online was Ethan's caption. She lost her Marine husband, and now the HOA is punishing her for flying the American flag he died defending. Within hours, the video had thousands of shares, then hundreds of thousands. People flooded the HOA Facebook page with angry comments. Veterans groups reposted the story. Military families shared their own experiences. And suddenly, a small neighborhood dispute became national outrage. Margaret had no idea any of this was happening, until reporters started showing up outside the subdivision entrance. By the next morning, everything had changed. News vans lined the street. People online began investigating the HOA. Old complaints surfaced. Former residents shared stories. Allegations of harassment, selective enforcement, intimidation tactics, and Carol Henderson's name started trending locally. Then came the interview that changed everything. A local reporter asked Margaret a simple question. "Why didn't you just remove the flag?" Margaret looked directly into the camera, eyes filled with tears, and quietly answered, "Because my husband never removed his uniform when his country asked him to serve." That clip spread everywhere. Millions of views overnight. Veterans began arriving outside Margaret's home carrying flags. Cars drove past honking in support. One man placed flowers beneath her porch. Another saluted her silently from the sidewalk. For the first time since Daniel died, Margaret didn't feel alone anymore. But inside the HOA, panic had started. Then the internet uncovered something shocking. Carol Henderson's own father was a retired Air Force veteran. Photos emerged online. Pictures of Carol standing beside military memorials for years. People were confused. How could someone with that background target a military widow over an American flag? But the real twist came days later. An anonymous former HOA board member leaked internal emails. And one message changed the entire story. According to the leak, multiple board members had actually opposed fining Margaret from the beginning. But Carol allegedly pushed aggressively for enforcement. Why? Because Margaret had previously challenged Carol over HOA spending months earlier. The flag issue may not have been about rules at all. It may have been personal revenge. That revelation ignited even more outrage. People weren't just angry anymore. They were disgusted. The next HOA meeting became chaos. Residents packed the room. Some stood against the walls. Others waited outside. Veterans arrived wearing uniforms and medals. When Carol entered, people booed. One resident stood up and said, "You dishonored a widow to protect your ego." Another shouted, "You should be ashamed." Carol attempted to defend the board's actions, but nobody was listening anymore. Then Margaret slowly walked to the front. Entire room silent. She placed her husband's folded military flag on the table and said something nobody expected. "I never wanted revenge. I only wanted respect." Some residents started crying. Even one board member wiped tears from his face. Then came the vote. Emergency motion. Remove all fines against Margaret. Publicly apologize. And begin proceedings to remove Carol as HOA president. The motion passed almost unanimously. The room erupted in applause. 3 days later, Carol Henderson resigned. The HOA released an official statement admitting poor judgment. But the damage was already done. National media had picked up the story. Veteran organizations invited Margaret to events. Thousands of people sent letters and gifts. One company even installed a massive professionally lit flagpole in her yard for free. And every evening after that, neighbors noticed something beautiful. People began placing small American flags outside their homes too, one by one, until the entire street was lined with them. Not because the HOA required it, but because Margaret reminded them what the flag actually meant. Sacrifice, memory, freedom. Months later, a reporter returned to interview Margaret again. This time she sat peacefully on her porch, the American flag waving softly above her. The reporter asked, "Did you ever expect the story to go viral?" Margaret smiled gently, then looked up at the flag and said, "No, I just hoped my husband wouldn't be forgotten." Pause. But forgotten. Daniel Wilson would never be forgotten again. Because one widow stood against humiliation. One neighborhood finally found its conscience. And one American flag reminded millions of people what respect truly looks like. Sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the loudest echoes. If this story moved you, subscribe for more emotional justice stories and unforgettable revenge moments. Comment below, was the HOA enforcing rules or abusing power?